Greetings and welcome to Informal Logic, Valid Arguments. We're going to be getting right into this one here. Again, this is to continue our series here on informal logic. So what we're getting into here is valid arguments, which we start to see a little bit more of the elements of formal logic creeping in here. So we start to see the formulaic and the structural elements of logic in general, and how they're applied to indeed, this is where the nexus here between our formal logic and our informal logic merges with our rhetoric and our grammar to be able to bring those formulas and such into the actual logical arguments and propositions, as you see here, are one of those essential elements. The element of the proposition here is something in contrast to questions, commands, challenges, and other moves made in arguments. The proposition is a unit that is either true or false. So, certain forms of argument are deductively valid, while others are invalid. So, to learn to identify these forms is a valuable tool in evaluating arguments reasonably. Again, the propositions, in contrast to questions, commands, challenges, and other moves made in arguments, are units of language that are true or false. So a proposition has essentially a Boolean element to it. 1 or 0, true or false. Arguments are built from propositions, the true or false statements. Real arguments are complex structures of subarguments. Identifying the subarguments helps analyze large networks of reasoning. The deductive validity is essential for organizing and evaluating arguments. So the deductive validity, which is what we're going to be focusing on here, validity determines whether conclusions logically flow from premises. So whereas whether the argument would be true or valid depends upon two different things, whether the structure or the underlying propositions. So let's continue. Deductive validity. So here's an example. If inflation is receding, the government's economic policies are sound. Inflation is receding. Therefore, the government's economic policies are sound. So this form of argument is so common that it has a traditional name, the modus ponens, or MP. Is it a valid form of argument? The answer depends on how we interpret the conditional, the if-then, in the first premise. So let's break this down here. The real-world arguments are often lengthy, confusing, and incomplete. Let's see, the try to get more done. If you ate a Wendy's Junior Bacon Cheeseburger, this world's upside down and backwards. Perhaps so. By the way, speaking to what you had mentioned before about live streams, I was just coaxed by YouTube creators to do members-only live streams and invite guests and panels and such. So I set that up, and I put it just at a nominal fee, whatever the low fee was for that. And it's I guess it's a test thing. They're not doing it with all creators, so perhaps that is one unspoken privilege that I'm jumping on right away. So that's just today, you're first to hear. So inspired by the previous comment. Yeah, if it thinks it stinks, here you go. Nevertheless, nothing stinking here. We're on to the truth and deductive validity here. So once again, we're looking at the modus ponens, is this type of argument here of deductive validity, but it depends upon the conditional if-then. So if inflation is receding, then the government's economic policies are sound. If this is true, now we can proceed, right, and say that the rest of it will come to a true conclusion. So let's break this down. Real-world arguments are often lengthy, confusing, and incomplete. Conclusion indicators, therefore, hence, since, identify key junctures. Therefore, the government, see, there it is right there. That's your juncture. Premises support the conclusion. Both are propositions. So the conclusion's a proposition and the premises are propositions. The modus ponens, MP, is a common valid form, and that form is this. If A, then B. A is true, therefore B. So if A is true, then B is true, whatever. So A is true, therefore B is true. Validity means if premises are true, the conclusion must be true if it's valid. So if the argument is valid and the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Must be true. Let's proceed. Identifying arguments. So here we go. This is a good little exercise here. You kind of have a duty to identify the arguments because not everyone is going to, they'll use rhetoric and other things sometimes and other bias type of approaches to try to persuade with what seems like an argument. But by identifying these sub-arguments within the complex structure, we can better interpret what their intention is by picking the most valid structure that leads most, I guess you could say, get the one that's most valid leading to their proposed conclusion, to give them the benefit of the doubt. So what we see here is an example. Air safety should be given a high priority. If we must try to prevent disastrous accidents, then air safety should be given a high priority. We must try to prevent disastrous accidents. So, without indicator words like therefore, if, then, well, we have an if, then here, but we don't have the indicator word of since, therefore. Those are the indicator words telling us a conclusion has been reached. Interpret propositions to form the coherent argument. So you have to interpret these propositions and restructure them so that they form a coherent argument in the best interest of trying to give the benefit of the doubt to the one proposing that argument. It's called the principle of charity. Prefer interpretations that make the arguments valid. So if they didn't present an argument in a valid structure, you would try to interpret, or if you are left to interpretation because of they've left some details out, then you would prefer an interpretation that makes their argument valid. And then if propositions are not true, well, then the conclusion would not be true, perhaps. So, but giving the structure, the validity, the principle of charity is one of the duties you would have in that kind of a dialogue. Multiple interpretations are possible, so select the most logically sound. Again, the benefit of the doubt. The example interpreted as valid, the modus ponens, versus an invalid form. So we'll see that in a second. The valid interpretation uses conditional structure correctly. So we want to do a valid interpretation of this word salad. So here's an example. If we must try to prevent disastrous accidents, if, then air safety should be given a high priority. We must try to prevent disastrous accidents. Therefore, air safety should be given a high priority. So if we want to do this, so this becomes now much simpler in a valid argument structure. And if we do agree that these propositions are true, then in fact our conclusion would be true because we have a valid form, the modus ponens. Let's proceed. Validity as a semantic concept. Philosophy 103. This is not even there yet. We're still on logic. This is logic 101, really. Yeah, if, then, sound, or cogent. Yeah. So here we go. As validity as a semantic concept. So the basic property of something being a valid argument is that it never takes you from true premise to a false conclusion. Basic property of something being a valid argument. So right there, it never would take you from true premises to a false conclusion. So an argument is said to be an enthymeme, and I think this predates the meme that we're so used to hearing in the common vernacular, which I believe was coined by Richard Dawkins. But the enthymeme, if there are premises, need to make the argument valid that are only tacitly but not explicitly stated or advanced as part of the argument. So this is what we're trying to say here, that the context is needed to determine these unstated assumptions here. The enthymeme or enthymeme. Validity is a semantic concept concerned with truth preservation. So the semantic concept is validity. It's not so much about the content as the semantic. So the semantic core consists of conclusions and premises. The pragmatic aspects include missing premises, the enthymemes. So the enthymemes are the incomplete ones, which we'll get into a little more detail real quick. The enthymemes require context to determine the unstated assumptions. So they're leaving parts of the argument structure out, but there's enough context to glean what they are supposed to be. Validity is conditional. If premises are true, conclusion must be true. Let's move along here. And we're on to the valid forms of argument. Here we have the modus ponens, the MP. If A, then B. If A is true, then B is true. A is true, therefore B is true. Valid argument forms guarantee truth preservation. So if some of these are true, a valid form will preserve that truth. The common valid forms, the MP, the MT, the HS, and the DS. We'll get into that. The modus ponens, the modus tollens, what is this? Some syllogism, and the disjunctive syllogism, hypothetical syllogism. All right, let's just continue here instead of stressing my memory. Validity stems from logical connectives meanings. So it's the logical connectives, not necessarily the truth or untruth of the propositions, but the logical connectives, meanings. The rule for disjunction, either A or B, requires at least one true. The rules for conditionals, if A, then B, false, only when A true and B false. You see this. A disjunction with or requires only one to be true. And for conditionals, if A then B is false only when A is true, B is false. Interesting. So an example here, modus tollens, which we just want to, we want to modus ponens, so the modus tollens is if A, then B, but it's not B. Therefore, it's not A. So if A, then B, and we use the negation here, the conditional that if A, then B, but if it's not B, therefore it's not A. So A would not be true. Let's look at this in a little more detail before we get too confused. Some of the basic forms of arguments. In constructing or evaluating arguments, it is most useful to know what some of the basic valid forms of arguments are. Indeed, some of them are displayed below along with their customary names. So we have the modus ponens, which we've been going over. If A, then B. If A is true, then B is true. A is true, therefore B is true. And then we just went over the modus tollens. If A, then B, but it's not B. Therefore, it's not A. So We go on to the hypothetical syllogism. If A, then B. If B, then C. Therefore, if A, then C. So we're going through the hypothetical, that connection, the logical connection between B and C and B and A, and using it as a go-between to come up with, therefore, if A, then C. And then we have the disjunctive syllogism with the or, either A or B. So it's got to be one or the other, and it's not A, therefore it's B. If it's not in this hand, it must be in the other. So we see how these are some of just the basic forms of valid arguments. So we have the MP, the MP, the MT, the HS, and the DS. Craig Carey says, just like AND or NAND and NOR gates with electricity. Well, exactly. Those are called logic circuits. Indeed, they relate exactly the same way. Each proposition is a binary. It's an on or off condition. So, yeah, these are the basics of electronics that you learn, the different gates. Indeed. Let's continue. Uh-oh, one there. There we go. So now we're on to invalid arguments. If A, then B. B, therefore A. Oh, wait a second. So if A is true, then B is true. B is true. Therefore, A is true. It's a little bit of circular reasoning here, isn't there? Invalid arguments lack truth preservation guarantee. The same argument can have multiple forms, some valid, some invalid. Finding invalid form doesn't automatically invalidate the argument, though. Common invalid forms: affirming consequent, denying antecedent. So this is your antecedent, and affirming the consequent. So if A, then B, here we are, that's what this is. B is true, therefore A is true. The invalidity doesn't make argument bad. It may be inductive or incomplete. So important aspect here. Example here, if it rains, the car will get wet at that time. The car is wet now. Therefore, it is raining now. You see how that invalid argument, the car is wet, and it's true. Also, if it rains, the car will get wet. So these are all true. Problem is, a conclusion can't necessarily follow from these. It may be raining now, but it may not. And this type of an argument is invalid because it's either, unless it's incomplete, it doesn't come to a valid conclusion based on the propositions. Let's move along here. Now we're on to the inconsistency. If courage is a virtue, then courage is an excellence of conduct. Courage is a virtue. Courage is not an excellence of conduct. It's an inconsistency. The inconsistency occurs when propositions imply contradiction. The contradiction A and not A must always be false. The rule for negation: not A has the opposite truth value of A. So we're looking at values, truth value. Remember, these are binaries here. Rule for conjunction: A and B is true only if both A and B are true. Inconsistencies can be explicit or derived from assumptions. Now we're getting a little complex. An example here is a contradiction is a proposition that is the opposite or negation of itself. A contradiction must always be false. Now we're on to composition and division. In any given day, a bus will use more gas than a car. Therefore, in any given day, more gas will be used by buses than by cars. It's It's a fallacy of composition. Incorrectly attributes distributive properties to collective wholes, because we don't know the ratio of cars to buses and if it's more significant than the amount being used. So it's a fallacy of composition. The fallacy of division incorrectly attributes collective properties to parts. And the critical distinction, collective versus distributive use of terms. Properties of parts don't necessarily transfer to wholes and vice versa. The critical question is, does the property compose or divide over the collection? And we saw in this example it certainly does. So example here is all the parts of this machine are iron. Therefore, this machine is made of iron. See how that works too. Is there oil in that machine? Is there any kind of paint or anything else on it? So again, there's a lot of distinctions in here with composition and division. Then we get to defeasible reasoning. Get a little complex here, so this is an easier one to grasp, I think. Generally, birds fly. Tweety is a bird. Therefore, Tweety flies. A defeasible generalization occupies a ground where no contravening evidence in the form of exceptions to the rule is known to exist, because it can be assumed to hold as a commitment in a normal situation. So the defeasible reasoning is tentative, though, and non-monotonic. So, yeah, what a great word, non-monotonic. So monotonic would be not varying, and non-monotonic would mean it could vary. Meaning that, again, some birds, generally, birds fly. The generally makes it tentative and might vary. It's non-monotonic. I'm not very fond of these, the lees, like the generalese and the mostlies and the typicallys, because those types of generalizations rely on presumptions. The presumptive generalizations are subject to exceptions, and they're not addressing these exceptions in the therefore. It contrasts with strict universal generalizations when there's no exceptions. So there are strict universal generalizations, but when it starts with a generally, it typically isn't a universal one. Critical questions: the depth of search, the burden of proof. Wow. And it requires open-mindedness to counter evidence. So again, do all birds fly? You need to be open-minded and have a depth to the search to really find out, are there birds that don't fly? And who has the burden of proof in this situation here when you're making a proposition such as generally birds fly, Tweety is a bird, therefore Tweety flies. Oh, and then everyone's favorite, the jumping to a conclusion. Wow. Yeah, this is from the Post. This is the 2008 edition where they brought in new examples. We'll go ahead and read this one here. 10 Arab fundamentalists hijacked planes and crashed them into the World Trade Center in New York City. Boy, a few years ago, I don't think I could read this, but I think we could get away with it now. The message is clear. Arabs are nothing but a pack of religious fanatics prone to violence. So the hasty generalization, overlooking counter evidence and context, and it's a very common error. Treating defeasible generalizations, as we just went over, as absolute. All birds fly. That kind of thing is a defeasible. Context matters. Generalizations may fail in non-ordinary circumstances. There's also the principle of tuteurism. Prefer the safer option under uncertainty. And again, it requires openness to counter evidence and alternatives. A common error in reasoning is to fail to take into account that many generalizations of the most common kind are subject to exceptions in circumstances that are not ordinary. So the circumstances being not ordinary and exceptions, that's where this error in reasoning doesn't really take into account those things. It makes jumping to the conclusion with hasty generalizations. All right, so now we're on to the summary. Deductive logic has many uses in the study of reasoned argument. It is, in fact, an indispensable tool in the study of argument. So the deductive validity is truth preserving. Monotonic, meaning not non-monotonic, meaning it doesn't vary. It's immune to new evidence. So it's truth preserving, the deductive validity. Defeasible reasoning, it's only tentative, non-monotonic, subject to defeat. So again, the defeasible reasoning is the generalies, the mostlies, the typicallys. And those are subject to defeat through exceptions in circumstances and non-ordinary events. Key tools: valid argument forms, inconsistency detection, and that principle of charity. So even when you do detect inconsistencies, you have the knowledge to be able to structure it in the most valid form to give the benefit of the doubt, and that principle of charity. Practical advice is avoid hasty conclusions. Evaluate the context thoroughly. Deductive logic is simpler, but more limited. Its defeasible reasoning is flexible, but complex. But although deductive logic is more strict and rigid, as deductive logic does, we see, bring in those elements of formal logic into the informal logic here, and thus more limited in its application, due to the rigid structure, to the kinds of arguments we commonly deal with, it is nevertheless simpler and theoretically easier to grasp. So when you think of it like this, that although the deductive logic is more strict and rigid, and thus more limited in its application to the kinds of arguments we commonly deal with, it is nevertheless simpler and theoretically easier to grasp than the kinds of arguments we commonly deal with. So the deductive logic is actually, once understood, a lot simpler and theoretically easier than a lot of the nonsense that takes its place these days. And with that said, I'd like to thank you all for joining me here on the study of informal logic and valid arguments. If you like this, then please do hit that thumbs up and get the word out that we're doing this here, and we'll continue with the series as time permits and as a popular demand request. With that said, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace out.